You are not lonely in the way people assume. You are something far more difficult to explain, because loneliness implies absence. But what you feel is not absence at all, it is presence. Too much of it, too many signals, too many shifts in tone, too many moments where something is said, but something else is meant. And over time, you stopped reacting out loud, not because you had nothing to say, but because saying it never seemed to land where it should. There is a strange moment in certain lives, quiet, almost unnoticeable, when you realize that being understood is not the default state of human connection. It is rare, conditional, fragile, and often accidental. You might remember a moment like this without even knowing it matters, a conversation where you revealed something honest and watched it dissolve into awkwardness. A friendship where you showed more truth than was comfortable and slowly became less invited. A room full of people laughing while you quietly calculated how much of yourself you would have to remove to belong there. At first, you adapt. Everyone does. You learn which version of you gets approval. You learn which emotions are too much. You learn that clarity can sometimes make people uncomfortable, so you soften it. You round the edges. You become easier to digest. But something happens when you do this long enough. You don't just adapt to people. You begin to disappear inside the adaptation. And then comes the quiet fracture. Not dramatic, not loud, just a slow internal realization that something essential is always being left outside the conversation. This is where the misunderstanding begins. People assume you prefer being alone because you dislike connection, but that is not what happened. You did not withdraw from people. You withdrew from distortion because at some point you started noticing something unsettling. Most social environments do not reward truth. They reward comfort, predictability, agreement, and you were not built for that kind of filtering. You see things too quickly. You feel shifts too deeply. You notice contradictions before they are even fully formed. And when you live like that, connection becomes complicated because every interaction becomes a translation problem. What was said, what was meant, what was hidden, what was performed. And over time, that weight accumulates until silence begins to feel cleaner than explanation. This is where solitude enters, not as escape, but as relief, not because you stopped caring, but because caring in that environment required you to constantly abandon pieces of your perception just to stay socially aligned. And there is a point where the mind quietly asks a question the heart cannot ignore. How long can I keep betraying what I see, just to remain included? Most people never reach that question, or they do, and answer it with silence they never name. But if you are here watching this, something inside you already knows. You were never disconnected. You were overstimulated by inauthenticity, and your silence is not emptiness. It is recognition. Recognition that something in the way you connect with the world was never meant to be effortless, because you do not experience people as surface-level interactions. You experience them as layers, and layers are exhausting to hold all at once. So you stop trying to hold everything, and in that stopping, something unexpected happens. You begin to hear yourself. Again, not the version of you shaped for approval, but the one that existed before translation became necessary. And that is where the real story begins, not with loneliness, but with perception. Too much of it. There is a threshold most people never consciously cross. A point where perception stops being simple and starts becoming layered. At first, you don't notice it happening. You just think you are observant or sensitive, or maybe just a little more thoughtful than others. But over time, something changes in the way you experience people. You begin to notice what is not being said, not in an exaggerated paranoid way, but in a quiet, almost automatic recognition. A slight pause before someone answers a question that should be simple. A smile that arrives half a second too late. A tone that says agreement, but a body that quietly disagrees. Words that try to stabilize a conversation, while something underneath it quietly destabilizes. Most people filter this out without knowing it. It never reaches conscious awareness. The mind discards it, because to process everything would be overwhelming. But in certain minds, that filter is thinner, or absent, or simply different. And that changes everything, because suddenly, social reality is no longer what people say it is. It becomes what is happening beneath what they say. And once you start perceiving that layer, you cannot fully unsee it. At first, this ability feels like clarity, even power. You understand people faster. You anticipate reactions before they happen. You recognize emotional shifts before they are verbalized. But clarity has a hidden cost. The more you see, the less you are able to pretend you don't, and most social environments are built on mutual pretending. Not deception in the malicious sense, but cooperation and filtering. Reality down to something comfortable enough to share. What you begin to experience is a growing mismatch. People around you seem to move through interactions smoothly, almost effortlessly, while you are quietly processing multiple channels of meaning at once. What is being said, what is being avoided, what is being performed, what is being suppressed. And this is where cognitive dissonance becomes not just a concept, but a lived experience, because you are constantly holding two versions of reality at the same time. The surface version that everyone agrees to, and the underlying version that nobody explicitly acknowledges. Most people resolve this tension automatically by favoring the surface, but if your perception does not let go easily, you stay inside the tension, and over time that becomes exhausting. Not because people are inherently exhausting, but because interpretation becomes constant. You are no longer simply participating in conversation. You are decoding it, and decoding requires energy, a kind of psychological processing that never fully shuts off. Even silence becomes meaningful. Even absence becomes data. Even simplicity begins to feel suspicious. This is where misunderstanding often forms between you and the world. People may assume you are overthinking, or that you are making things more complex than they are. But from your perspective, nothing feels added. Everything feels revealed. And there is a difference, because overthinking is construction, but what you are experiencing feels more like exposure, as if the layers were always there, and you simply stopped ignoring them. In that state, normal social environments begin to feel strangely inconsistent, not dangerous, not hostile, just misaligned, like trying to listen to multiple conversations at once. In a room where everyone insists there is only one, and this is where something subtle begins to shift inside you. You start to notice that the most peaceful moments are not the ones filled with people who understand you, but the ones where nothing requires interpretation at all. No decoding, no second guessing, no emotional translation, just direct experience. This is where solitude begins to reframe itself, not as withdrawal, but as regulation. Way for the mind to stop processing contradictions it never agreed to carry in the first place, because when perception becomes too layered for too long, the nervous system does not ask for more stimulation. It asks for clarity, and clarity for minds like this rarely comes from more input. It comes from less interference, from spaces where what is seen is exactly what is. There, no hidden layers, no emotional subtext demanding constant analysis, no social performance unfolding beneath the surface of every exchange, just quiet. And in that quiet, something important happens. The mind stops interpreting reality as a puzzle to solve and begins to experience it as something that can simply be lived without translation. There is a kind of betrayal that does not arrive as a single moment. It does not announce itself. It does not break anything loudly. It accumulates slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. At first, it looks like misunderstanding. You say something honest, something unfiltered, and the room shifts slightly. Not dramatically, but enough for you to notice. A pause that lingers too long. A smile that tightens instead of opens. A subject gently redirected before it can fully land. You learn to interpret these moments as coincidence, but they repeat. Different people, different settings, same pattern. You begin to notice that your most natural expressions, your curiosity, your depth, your willingness to say what others avoid, do not always create connection. Sometimes they create distance, sometimes discomfort, sometimes silence that feels heavier than words. And slowly, without anyone explicitly telling you, you start receiving a message. Not through rejection, but through response. Certain parts of you are welcomed, certain parts are ignored, and certain parts are quietly discouraged. This is where belonging begins to change shape, because belonging, at least the way most people experience it, is not unconditional. It is negotiated. And negotiations always have terms. At first, you try to adjust without noticing it as adjustment. You soften your language. You delay your honesty. You learn when to speak fully and when to compress your thoughts into something lighter, easier, more socially efficient. And it works. On the surface, you are still included, still present, still part of things, but something subtle begins to happen internally. Every time you reduce yourself to maintain connection, a quiet dissonance forms, not dramatic, not painful in a way you can easily name, just a faint sense that something essential is being left out of the interaction. As if you are constantly arriving somewhere slightly incomplete. Over time, this becomes familiar. So familiar that you stop questioning it, and instead, you start adapting more efficiently. You learn the version of you that creates the least friction, the version that keeps things flowing, keeps things easy, keeps things acceptable. But there is a cost that does not announce itself immediately, because the more efficiently you adapt to being accepted, the further you drift from the parts of you that required no adaptation at all. And that is where the fracture begins, not between you and others, but between you and yourself. You're still socially connected, but internally, something begins to split. One part of you participates, the other part observes. One part speaks in socially optimized language, the other part remembers what was never said. And over time, that observer part grows stronger, not because it is chosen, but because it is needed, because someone inside you has to keep track of what is. Being lost in translation, this is where a quiet realization begins to form. It does not arrive as a thought at first. It arrives as a feeling that being fully yourself requires a level of risk that most environments are not designed to absorb, because truth, in its raw form, disrupts emotional predictability. And most social systems, friendships, workplaces, even families, are built on maintaining a certain level of predictability. People want to know what version of you they are going to get. They want emotional consistency. They want interactions that do not require recalibration. And so, anything that disrupts that stability, however honest, however real, tends to get filtered out, not because it is wrong, but because it is disruptive. And slowly, you begin to internalize a dangerous equation. The more honest you are, the more unstable the environment becomes. So you begin to make a choice without consciously recognizing it as a choice. You trade depth for stability, truth for continuity, expression for ease, and it works socially but internally. Something begins to fade, not your ability to connect, but your willingness to fully enter the connection as yourself, and that is where the slow betrayal completes its first cycle, because what you are losing is not just expression, it is the belief that full expression is safe, and once that belief is weakened enough, something irreversible begins to form. Silence starts to feel safer than honesty, not because silence is natural to you, but because silence does not require you to negotiate your own existence, and that is the quiet shift most people never notice in themselves. They do not stop speaking, they stop risking being fully heard, and in that shift, belonging changes again. It becomes less about being seen and more about being manageable. But deep inside, something remembers what it felt like before management became necessary, and that memory does not disappear. It waits until eventually it becomes a question you can no longer ignore. If belonging requires you to become less real, what exactly are you belonging to? If you zoom out far enough from a single light, something becomes visible that is almost uncomfortable to admit. The patterns are not personal, they are structural. What you experienced as isolation, confusion, or even misalignment with others is not only the result of individual differences. It is also the product of systems that shape how human attention, behavior, and identity are formed in the first place. Because societies do not evolve around truth as much as they evolve around stability, and stability requires simplification. This is where something subtle begins to happen across history. Every era produces its own version of a conflict between depth and speed. The individuals who slow things down, those who question, reflect, hesitate, or complicate simple narratives are rarely welcomed with ease, not because they are incorrect, but because they interrupt flow. And most systems, whether political, economic, or social, depend on flow more than they depend on accuracy. A question that delays action is often treated as more disruptive than a false assumption that allows it. This is not a conspiracy in the traditional sense. It is a design principle of large human systems: efficiency over reflection, consensus over complexity, momentum over truth. And over time, these priorities shape not only institutions, but people, because every environment teaches its participants how to survive within it. There were always individuals in history who seemed misaligned with this structure, thinkers who did not fit cleanly into the pace of their time, people whose observations required more space than society was willing to give, voices that introduced uncertainty into systems that depended on certainty to function. Many of them were not necessarily rejected outright. They were simply set aside, not as punishment, but as a kind of social correction, because depth, by its nature, resists compression, and compressed environments do not know how to hold it. In the modern world, this dynamic does not disappear. It intensifies, because for the first time in history, attention itself has become a controlled environment. You are not just living in society, you are living inside continuous input. Information is no longer something you seek, it is something that seeks you, And it arrives not slowly, like a letter or a book, but in fragments, rapid, competing, constantly shifting fragments that demand reaction before reflection is possible. In such an environment, speed becomes more valuable than understanding. Reaction becomes more rewarded than comprehension. And visibility becomes more important than authenticity. Because to be visible now is not simply to exist. It is to perform existence in a way that can be consumed. And this is where something fundamental changes in human behavior. People begin to curate themselves, not consciously at first, but gradually they learn which parts of themselves produce engagement, which emotions are acceptable in public space, which thoughts are too complex to express without losing attention, and so expression becomes selective, not necessarily dishonest, but filtered. And over time, the filtered version begins to replace the original. What you end up interacting with in modern life is not always the person themselves. It is a representation, a socially optimized version of identity designed for reception and for someone who perceives deeply. This creates a strange form of friction because you are not only listening to what people say, you are also sensing what has been removed. Before it was said, what was simplified, what was shaped, what was edited out of the emotional and intellectual transmission. And this creates a kind of double exposure of reality. On one layer, you are interacting with people. On another layer, you are constantly aware of the distance between the person and their presentation, and that distance becomes exhausting to ignore, not because you are suspicious, but because perception does not turn off easily once it has expanded. So even simple interactions begin to carry additional weight. A sentence is no longer just a sentence. It is a product of selection. A moment is no longer just a moment. It is the result of what someone allowed to be visible. And over time, this changes how connection feels, because connection depends on presence. But presence becomes harder to access when everything is mediated through performance. This is where solitude begins to take on a different meaning, not as escape from people, but as escape from representations, from the constant need to interpret not just what is real, but what has been shaped into something socially acceptable. And slowly, a realization forms that is difficult to ignore. You are not only interacting with individuals, you are interacting with the pressure placed upon individuals by their environment. And once you see that clearly, you begin to understand something deeper. The fragmentation you feel is not only internal, it is systemic. Because when a world rewards partial expression, it inevitably produces partial connection. And in that world, those who seek wholeness in perception will always feel slightly out of place, not because they are ahead, not because they are behind, but because they are still looking for something that the system was never designed to preserve. Unfiltered reality. There is a tension that never fully resolves for people who think deeply, a constant pull in two directions. On one side, the need to be understood. On the other, the need to remain whole. And somewhere between those two forces, something begins to wear down. At first, it feels manageable, even normal. You enter relationships expecting mutual understanding to develop naturally over time. You assume that if you are honest enough, clear enough, patient enough, eventually the gap between your internal world and someone else's perception will close. But slowly, something more complicated reveals itself. Understanding is not just about honesty. It is about capacity. Capacity to hold complexity. Capacity to sit with contradiction. capacity to stay present when meaning becomes layered rather than simple. And not everyone has that capacity in the same measure. So what often happens is not rejection in the obvious sense. It is reduction. You begin expressing yourself in ways that are easier to receive. You shorten explanations. You simplify emotions. You filter thoughts before they fully form into words. Not because you are hiding, but because you are trying to be received without distortion. And it works to a degree. Connections continue. Conversations flow. Relationships remain intact. But something subtle shifts underneath. Because every time you compress your internal world to fit into a shared space, a quiet trade is made. You gain connection, but you lose expression. And over time, that loss accumulates in ways that are difficult to name. You may find yourself in rooms full of people who care about you, yet still feeling like something essential is not entering the exchange. Not because they are not listening, but because what you are offering has been quietly edited before it even reaches them. This is where emotional exhaustion begins to form in a very specific way. Not the exhaustion of being alone, but the exhaustion of being partially present, of constantly translating your inner reality into something socially consumable. At first, you call it communication, then adaptation. Eventually, it becomes habit, and habits are dangerous when they begin to feel like identity, because without noticing it, you start to internalize a subtle belief. That full expression might be too much. That clarity might create distance. That depth might require too much effort from others. And so you adjust again. More refinement, more control, more restraint. Until one day, you realize something quietly unsettling. You are being understood, but not fully seen. And there is a difference that is hard to explain to someone who has never felt it. Being understood means your words make sense to others. Being seen means your internal world is recognized without excessive translation. One is intellectual alignment. The other is existential recognition. And when the second is missing, connection begins to feel strangely hollow, even when everything looks correct from the outside. This is where identity begins to fragment in subtle ways, because part of you continues to participate in relationships as normal, while another part of you quietly observes how much of yourself you are no longer expressing. And over time, that observing part becomes more active. It starts noticing patterns, moments where you almost said something real and didn't. Conversations where you felt something meaningful but chose something safer instead. Relationships where you are present physically but partially absent internally. And then comes a question that does not arrive loudly but persistently. When was the last time you felt fully understood without explaining yourself? Not partially, not approximately, not close enough, but fully, and for many that question creates a silence that is difficult to fill quickly, because the answer is often not recent or not frequent, or sometimes not at all in the way it truly matters. And another question follows, quieter but sharper. Do your relationships require you to shrink, even subtly? Not through force, not through demand, but through pattern. Through what is rewarded, through what is received easily, through what creates less friction in the moment. And if the answer is even partially yes, then something begins to shift in how connection is perceived. Because you start to recognize that not all distance is physical. Some of it exists inside the way you are allowed to exist around others. And this is where the emotional contradiction becomes unavoidable. You want connection, but connection requires reduction. You want honesty, but honesty sometimes destabilizes the very spaces you rely on. And holding both truths at once creates a pressure that does not resolve easily. So people adapt in different ways. Some choose silence in moments where expression feels too costly. Others choose surface-level comfort over deeper exposure. Some oscillate endlessly between openness and withdrawal, never fully settled in either. But for those who consistently think and feel deeply, another pattern begins to emerge. Silence stops feeling like absence. It starts feeling like preservation. Not because connection is unimportant, but because the cost of maintaining it at full depth becomes increasingly visible. And in that realization, something shifts quietly but permanently. You begin to understand that staying connected in certain environments does not just ask for your time, it asks for your reduction. And at some point, the question is no longer whether you can stay connected, but whether staying connected in that form is worth what it slowly removes from you. Because sometimes the highest price of connection is not loneliness. It is the gradual disappearance of the parts of you that made connection meaningful in the first place. At some point, something begins to change in the way solitude feels, not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, almost imperceptibly. What once felt like absence starts to feel like relief, and what once felt like loneliness begins to feel like space. Space that does not ask you to adjust your thoughts mid-sentence. Space that does not require you to translate emotion into something socially acceptable. Space that does not reward performance over presence. And in that space, something unexpected begins to return. You're not the version of you shaped by interaction, not the version of you optimized for understanding, not the version of you edited for acceptance, but the unfiltered version, the one that exists before interpretation begins. This is where solitude stops being a retreat and starts becoming a recalibration. Because when you are constantly engaged with others, something subtle happens to perception itself. You begin to see through shared frameworks, shared language, shared expectations. And while this allows connection, it also creates distortion. You are no longer experiencing reality directly. You are experiencing reality through negotiation. What should be said? What should be softened? What should be withheld? What will be understood correctly? And over time, that negotiation becomes exhausting. Not because interaction is inherently draining, but because identity becomes continuous adjustment. And adjustment, when repeated enough times, begins to feel like erosion. This is where solitude begins to reassert its function, not as escape from the world, but as a return to something more stable inside you. Because in solitude, there is no need to perform coherence. There is no audience to maintain, no expectation to satisfy, no social mirror reflecting back a version of you that must be managed. There is only direct experience, and direct experience does something subtle but profound to the mind. It removes interference. Thoughts stop being shaped by anticipated reactions. Emotions stop being filtered through social consequence. Perception stops splitting itself into acceptable and unacceptable forms, and what remains is something closer to clarity than most people are used to experiencing in daily life. This is why solitude feels different for deep thinkers. It is not emptiness, it is alignment. A return to internal consistency after prolonged external fragmentation. And in that alignment, something often misunderstood begins to emerge. Strength, not the kind that is displayed, not the kind that is performed, but the kind that forms when a mind is no longer constantly adjusting itself to fit external expectations. In solitude, you are not becoming less connected to the world. You are becoming less distorted by it. And that distinction changes everything. Because when you stop constantly translating yourself for others, you begin to notice how much of your energy was being spent on maintaining legibility, not truth, not depth, not even expression, but legibility. The need to be easily understood within systems that were never designed to hold complexity without simplification. And once that pressure is removed, something stabilizes internally. Thoughts begin to complete themselves without interruption. Emotions begin to surface without immediate suppression. Questions begin to exist without needing immediate resolution. And in that state, clarity does not arrive as insight. It arrives as absence of noise. This is where a quiet realization forms. You were not becoming stronger by withdrawing from people. You were becoming clearer by removing constant distortion. And clarity, once experienced, is difficult to confuse with anything else. Because it does not feel like achievement. It feels like return. Return to a state where you are no longer divided between what you are and what you present, where nothing inside you has to be reduced in order to exist externally. And this is where identity begins to shift in a deeper way. Because solitude stops being something you use to recover. It becomes something that reveals what was always there beneath adaptation. A self that does not require constant negotiation to remain intact. This is where the meaning of being alone changes completely. You are not stepping away from life. You are stepping away from distortion. And in that space, something becomes undeniable. Silence is not absence, it is alignment. And once alignment is experienced deeply enough, returning to constant misalignment no longer feels neutral. It feels like loss, not loss of people, but loss of clarity. Which is why solitude is no longer just where you go when everything becomes too much. It becomes where you go to remember what you are without interference. And in that remembering, another realization emerges quietly but firmly. You are not alone. You are unfiltered. And that difference changes how you see everything that comes after. There is a point in understanding where everything begins to reorganize itself, not because new information appears, but because old interpretations stop making sense. What once felt like a flaw begins to look like structure. What once felt like distance begins to look like clarity. What once felt like misalignment begins to look like perception without distortion. And in that shift, something fundamental collapses. The idea that you were ever too deep in the first place. Because depth, as it turns out, was never the problem. It was never excess, never burden, never malfunction. It was simply awareness operating in environments that reward reduction. And reduction is not the same as truth. For a long time, you may have interpreted your experience through the lens of incompatibility, as if something in you was slightly out of place in the world you move through, as if connection required adjustment, as if belonging required simplification, as if ease with others required quieting something essential inside you. But over time, a different interpretation begins to form, one that does not accuse you of being too much, but instead questions whether the environments you moved through were designed to hold what you naturally perceive. Because when everything around you favors speed over depth, reaction over reflection, and surface over substance. Clarity itself can start to feel like deviation, not because it is wrong, but because it does not compress easily, and what does not compress is often treated as resistance. This is where the misunderstanding deepens for many people who think deeply. They assume they are struggling with connection, when in reality, they are struggling with distortion. Because connection requires presence, but presence becomes fragmented when everything is filtered through expectation, performance, and unspoken social calibration. And over time, you begin to realize something, subtle but irreversible. You were not stepping away from connection. You were stepping away from misalignment that masqueraded as connection. And that distinction quietly changes the entire narrative of your life, because suddenly, solitude is no longer evidence of failure to belong. It becomes evidence of refusal to disappear into forms of belonging that require internal reduction. And in that refusal, something stabilizes. The need to constantly justify your perception begins to fade. The pressure to translate your inner world into acceptable fragments begins to loosen. The belief that understanding must always come at the cost of self-betrayal begins to weaken, and what remains is not isolation in the emotional sense, but clarity without interference. State where you are no longer splitting yourself between what you experience and what you are, allowed to express, and in that state, a realization arrives quietly, not as revelation, but as recognition. You were never disconnected in the way you were told to believe. You were simply aware of the gap between appearance and reality more consistently than those around you. And that awareness can feel like distance when everything around you depends on shared simplification. But distance from distortion is not the same as distance from life. It is often the beginning of seeing life more directly, and once that becomes clear, the old narrative no longer holds weight. You stop asking why you don't fit everywhere, because the question itself begins to feel misplaced. Not every environment is designed for depth. Not every interaction is designed for presence. Not every form of belonging is designed for wholeness. And realizing this does not create bitterness. It creates precision, a clearer sense of where you are able to exist fully and where you begin to fragment. And that is where the final shift happens. The identity that once believed it was too deep begins to dissolve, not into something smaller, but into something more accurate. You are no longer someone trying to make sense of why solitude feels necessary. You are someone who understands what clarity costs in environments built for noise. And in that understanding, there is no longer a need to justify your distance from distortion, only awareness of what it protects and what it preserves. Because at the end of everything, beneath the psychology, beneath the social dynamics, beneath the history of how people learn to fit or withdraw, there remains a simple truth that does not change. You were not meant to belong everywhere. You were meant to see clearly, even if it meant standing apart.